A single shot echoes through the rubble-choked streets of Cologne. Inside a Panther tank, the German commander freezes, his periscope trained on an unfamiliar silhouette emerging from the smoke. The profile is wrong, lower than a Sherman, wider, more menacing. For a fatal second, he hesitates, his finger hovering over the firing command. Is it German? Impossible. But before he can decide, a 90mm shell screams toward him at 2,700 feet per second. In the next 90 seconds, everything German tank commanders believed about their superiority will shatter. This is the story of the day American armor finally fought back. Cologne, Germany. The street lies choked with rubble. Smoke drifts through shattered buildings. Two M4 Sherman tanks edge forward, supporting infantry advancing toward the cathedral. The massive Gothic spires, somehow still standing after 262 separate bombing raids, loom over a city that has become a corpse. The lead Sherman commander, technician 5th grade Robert Kellner, scans the intersection ahead. Behind him, the 2nd Sherman follows cautiously. They've been doing this for days. Clear a street, support the infantry, move to the next block. The routine feels almost mechanical until the Panther fires. Two 75mm shells punch through the lead Sherman's gun shield in rapid succession. The armor, 81mm thick and designed to stop early war German tanks, might as well be paper. Inside, the effect is catastrophic. The driver dies instantly. The gunner is mortally wounded. The tank commander, Kellner, staggers from the smoking turret, one leg blown off below the knee. The 2nd Sherman's driver slams the transmission into reverse, but it's too late. A 3rd German shell tears through the tracks. The crew bails out. The Panther, a Panzer V Model A from Panzer Brigade 106 Feldherrnhau, waits in ambush near the train station. Its commander, 2nd Lieutenant Wilhelm Bartelborth, has chosen his position well. The demolished Hohenzollern Bridge behind him means no retreat, only forward, only fighting. His tank, with its sloped frontal armor and high-velocity gun, has been terrorizing Sherman crews since Normandy. But 3 blocks away, rolling down a parallel street, is something Bartelborth has never seen before, something his intelligence officers never warned him about, something that will in the next 90 seconds shatter every assumption German tank commanders had made about American armor, the M26 Pershing, and with it, the end of German tank supremacy on the Western Front. To understand why the Pershing mattered, why its appearance in early 1945 represented such a psychological shock to German tank crews, you have to understand the contempt, the absolute certainty of superiority that German armored forces had developed over 2 years of combat against American tanks. It wasn't just confidence, it was mathematical certainty. The Sherman, 46,000 of them built, the backbone of American armored forces, had been adequate against early war German tanks. The Panzer III and Panzer IV, even good. Even the 75mm gun could penetrate their armor at combat ranges. The sloped frontal armor could sometimes deflect incoming fire. But by late 1943, when the Panther and Tiger entered mass production, the Sherman became, in the eyes of German tank commanders, little more than target practice. The numbers were brutal. A Sherman's frontal armor, 81mm at best, was sloped, but still vulnerable. The 75mm M3 gun, low velocity and designed for reliability rather than penetration, was useless against the Panther's frontal armor, 100mm thick and heavily sloped, at any range, beyond point blank. Against the Tiger's frontal plate, 102mm of flat but incredibly hard steel, it was equally hopeless. German tank commanders knew this. They'd proven it in Normandy, at Mortagne in the Hürtgen forest. Panthers could engage Shermans at 2,000 yards and destroy them with near impunity. Tigers, with their 88 mm guns, could kill Shermans from even farther. The Americans compensated with numbers. For every Panther, there might be 5 Shermans. For every Tiger, 10. The strategy was crude but effective. Overwhelm through mass, accept losses, keep advancing. But the psychological cost was immense. American tank crews knew every time they rolled out that they were outmatched, that if they encountered a Panther or Tiger, survival meant flanking, ambush, artillery support, or airstrikes, never a fair fight. The Sherman crews developed gallows humor. They called their tanks Ronsons after the lighter company's advertising slogan, "Lights first time, every time," or Tommy Cooker's, the British equivalent, because when 88 hit a Sherman, it didn't just penetrate, it ignited. The ammunition stowed throughout the hull caught fire. Crews had seconds to escape before the entire vehicle became an inferno. German tank commanders, particularly those in SS Panzer divisions, viewed American armor with something approaching disdain. They respected American artillery, feared American air power. But the tanks? One Tiger commander interviewed after the war described engaging Shermans as, quote, "hardly sport. The poor fools charged bravely and died bravely, but they died." Another commander from a Panther battalion noted in his diary, "They have so many tanks, they can afford to waste them." We cannot afford to waste even one, but neither can they afford to face us fairly. This contempt wasn't irrational. It was based on cold, hard statistics. A 1946 study by the U.S. Army Ballistic Research Laboratory examined armor-on-armor engagements in 1944. Despite eventual Sherman victories, often due to overwhelming numbers and combined arms tactics, the individual tank versus tank encounters told a darker story. A Tiger's kill-to-loss ratio was over 5-1. Some Tiger battalions achieved ratios exceeding 12-1. Panthers, though less mechanically reliable and more vulnerable than Tigers, still dominated Shermans in direct combat. American tankers knew this. American commanders knew this. But production priorities, strategic calculations, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the quality of the German tank threat had led to a decision that would haunt GIs across France and Germany. The Sherman was, in the words of the U.S. Army's own assessments, good enough, not great, not equal to German heavy armor, but adequate when used in mass with proper support. Except it wasn't, not psychologically, not for the crews who climbed into those tanks knowing that enemy armor could kill them from ranges where they couldn't effectively fight back, not for the officers who watched their units take 30, 40, 50% losses in tank versus tank engagements. And certainly not for the men pulling their wounded buddies from burning hulls. By December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the situation had become critical. German armor, including over 400 Panthers and dozens of Tigers and King Tigers, concentrated for a massive counteroffensive. American tank losses spiked. The inadequacy of the 75mm gun became undeniable. Even the upgraded Sherman with the 76mm gun couldn't reliably penetrate Panther frontal armor beyond point-blank range. A New York Times correspondent, Hanson Baldwin, published a scathing article on January 5, 1945. The headline asked, "Why, at this late stage in the war, are American tanks inferior to the enemy's?" The article detailed what tankers already knew, that German armor was superior in firepower and protection, that American tank crews were paying for that inferiority with their lives. The article created a scandal. Congress called for inquiries. The public demanded answers. Public demanded answers, but they also knew what they had, a tank that, on paper at least, could trade shots with anything the Germans fielded. Early moved forward parallel to the Panthers' position, planning to approach from a side street to catch Bartlebor's crew from the flank. It was standard tactics, and even with a better tank, why risk a frontal engagement when a flank shot guaranteed a kill? Technical Sergeant James Bates, a Signal Corps photographer attached to the 3rd Armored Division, had taken position in a building overlooking the intersection. He'd watched the Shermans get destroyed, watched the survivors bail out. Now, setting up his 16mm camera, he watched the Panther's turret slowly traverse, watching, waiting. Inside the Panther, Bartleborth studied the side street through his periscope. He'd seen American tanks approach this way before, always Shermans. High silhouette, distinctive turret shape, easy to identify, easy to kill. His gunner, already on target, waited for the command to fire. One shot, maybe two, another kill to add to the tally. The routine was so familiar it was almost boring. Then Early's Pershing nosed around the corner, and for a critical, fatal second, Bartleborth hesitated. The silhouette was wrong, lower than a Sherman, the turret shape unfamiliar. German, impossible. But the profile was similar to German designs, low, wide, sloped armor. For a moment, Bartleborth later told his family he thought it might be a Panther from another unit. He told his gunner to hold fire, to confirm the target. That hesitation cost him everything. Inside the Pershing, Corporal Clarence Smoyer, the gunner, saw the Panther immediately, saw the gun barrel aimed toward where they would emerge. But Early had already committed to the maneuver. The Pershing continued, rolling forward. Smoyer's hand was on the firing control, traversing the turret, trying to get the sights onto the target. Normally, a tank stops before firing, stabilizes, allows the gunner a steady platform, but there was no time. The Panther was right there, gun aimed, waiting. Smoyer fired, on the move. The 90mm gun roared. The entire Pershing rocked back on its suspension. Inside, the noise was overwhelming, even with headphones. The recoil threw the gun sight off target. Smoyer couldn't see if he'd hit, but he'd fired first. That was something. In most tank versus tank engagements, the tank that fired first, that scored the first hit, won. The armor-piercing shell, 24 pounds of hardened steel, traveling at 2,700 feet per second, struck the Panther just below the gun shield. The impact was catastrophic. The shell punched through the frontal armor. 80mm of steel that had stopped dozens of Sherman rounds punched through and detonated inside the fighting compartment. Shrapnel ricocheted through the interior. The loader died instantly. The gunner was wounded. The driver, sealed in his compartment, felt the shockwave but wasn't directly hit. But Smoyer didn't know if the Panther was dead, couldn't see through the smoke and dust. Early screamed at the driver to keep moving. Don't stop. Don't become a stationary target. The Pershing rolled fully into the intersection. Smoyer fired again. The second shell hit the Panther's side. This one punched completely through, in one side, out the other, the tungsten core penetrator, creating a supersonic tunnel of destruction through the crew compartment. Still, the Panther didn't burn. German tanks, with their carefully separated ammunition storage and less gasoline-dependent diesel engines, didn't light up as easily as Sherman's. Smoyer, taking no chances, fired a third time. Another side hit. This one ignited something inside. Smoke poured from the hatches. The surviving crew members, Bartleborth among them, bailed out. One crewman would die later in a hospital. Bartleborth escaped. The entire engagement, from the Pershing rounding the corner to the Panther crew abandoning their vehicle, took less than 90 seconds. Those 90 seconds, captured on film by Sergeant Bates, would become the most famous tank duel of the war. Not because it was the largest, not even because it was the most significant tactically, but because it was filmed, because it could be shown to the American public, to Congress, to the critics who demanded to know why American tanks were inferior. Look, the footage said, we're not inferior anymore. The psychological impact of the Cologne duel rippled through both armies. For American tankers, the message was clear. Finally, they had a tank that could fight. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole of the 3rd Armored Division, the top American tank ace with over 250 enemy vehicles destroyed, had lost his leg when his Sherman was hit by a Panther in September 1944. He later said that if they'd had Pershings in Normandy, the war would have ended months earlier. Maybe that was hyperbole, maybe not. What mattered was the belief, the confidence. American tank crews who'd spent months knowing they were outgunned suddenly felt they could compete. For German tank commanders, the impact was different, more subtle, but no less significant. The Pershing's appearance confirmed something they suspected but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. American industrial power wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about quality, about closing the technological gap, about producing tanks that could match German designs. A week before Cologne, on February 26th, a Pershing from the 3rd Armored Division had destroyed a Tiger I and 3 other German tanks in a single engagement near Elsdorf. No film crew captured that battle. Few people outside the immediate participants even knew it happened, but the after-action reports circulated through German command. A Tiger destroyed by frontal fire from an American tank. Another engagement near Dessau in early April saw a modified Pershing designated T-26-4 mounting an even longer 90mm gun encounter German armor. This so-called Super Pershing, with additional armor welded to the bow and turret, destroyed a King Tiger. The King Tiger, Germany's ultimate heavy tank, 70 tons, 180 millimeters of frontal armor, the invincible beast that could shrug off hits from anything the Allies fielded, destroyed by an American tank firing from over 1,000 yards. These engagements were rare. Only about 20 Pershings saw combat in World War II. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, just 3 months after the first Pershings arrived. 310 were shipped to Europe by Vide, but most never fired a shot in anger. The impact on the war's outcome was minimal. Germany was already collapsing. The Allies would have won without the Pershing, but the psychological impact, that was profound. German tank commanders, particularly the veterans who dominated European battlefields since 1940, had to recalibrate. The Americans weren't a joke anymore, weren't just throwing masses of inferior tanks at superior German engineering. They'd learned, they'd adapted, and they'd produced a weapon that worked. The Pershing's design reflected lessons learned from years of watching American tanks die. The thick-sloped frontal armor mirrored the Panther's design philosophy. The 90mm gun matched roughly the penetration capability of German 88mm weapons. The low profile reduced visibility and made the tank harder to hit. The wide tracks, similar to German designs, reduced ground pressure and improved mobility in mud and snow. But the Pershing also retained American design priorities: reliability, ease of maintenance, crew comfort. The interior, while cramped by the standards of a stateside factory, was spacious compared to German tanks. The crew had more room to work, more room to escape if hit. And tactically, commanders kept using them as tanks, not as specialized anti-tank weapons, because commanders needed armor, needed vehicles that could take hits and keep fighting. General Jacob Devers, head of the armored force, pushed for heavy tanks, for vehicles that could match German Panthers and Tigers, for tanks that American crews could take into battle without feeling like they were driving coffins. The T-26, the prototype that would become the Pershing, was his baby. But production was delayed repeatedly by debates over specifications, by competing priorities, by the belief, somehow persisting despite all evidence, that the Sherman was adequate. Only the Battle of the Bulge broke through this institutional inertia. When the German counteroffensive demonstrated yet again that American armor was outmatched, When tank losses spiked and calls for better tanks became impossible to ignore, only then were the Pershings rushed to Europe. Only then was production accelerated, by which time the war had 3 months left. So, the real legacy of the Pershing wasn't in World War II. It was in Korea and in the development philosophy it established for American tanks going forward. In Korea, from 1950 to 1953, M26 Pershings faced Soviet T-34-85s, fielded by North Korean and Chinese forces. The T-34-85, a formidable medium tank, had an 85mm gun that could threaten Shermans. Against Pershings, it was outmatched. The 90mm gun could penetrate T-34 armor at any combat range. The Pershing armor could generally stop 85mm fire at anything beyond point-blank range. A 1954 survey showed that Pershings accounted for 32% of American tank kills in Korea, despite making up a smaller percentage of deployed armor. The kill-to-loss ratio heavily favored the Pershing. It proved that the design worked, that American tankers, given equipment equal or superior to their opponents, could dominate. But the Pershing also revealed its flaws in Korea. The underpowered engine struggled in Korea's mountainous terrain. The transmission failures that had plagued European service became worse. Maintenance requirements were high. By 1951, the Pershing was being replaced by the M26 Patton, essentially an M26 with a better engine and improved transmission. The same design, refined, made reliable, made effective. And the Patton led to the M47, and the M47 to the M48, and the M48 eventually to the M60, a direct lineage. Each generation learned from the last, each improving on the formula. Better guns, better armor, better engines, better fire control. The philosophy established by the Pershing that American tanks should be equals to any potential enemy armor became doctrine. Never again would American tankers go into battle knowing they were outmatched. The tactical revolution the Pershing represented went beyond simple statistics. It changed how American armored units could operate. Before the Pershing, American tank tactics in Europe had evolved into a grim calculus. When encountering German heavy armor, the standard doctrine was to fix and flank. One Sherman would engage frontally, drawing fire, often dying in the process, while the German tank focused on this sacrifice. Other Shermans would maneuver to the flanks and rear, where armor was thinner. It worked, but it required coordination, time, and often the acceptance that someone would die to make it work. Battalion commanders became intimately familiar with these mathematics. If you had 5 Shermans and encountered a Panther, you'd probably win, but you'd lose 2, maybe 3 tanks in the process. The crews knew this. They knew that when the colonel said, "We need to take that position," he was implicitly saying, "Some of you won't be coming back." The psychological burden of this knowledge weighed on everyone. Survivors carried guilt. Commanders carried responsibility for deaths that seemed, in retrospect, preventable if only they'd had better equipment. The Pershing disrupted this terrible arithmetic. A Pershing could engage a Panther frontally with reasonable confidence of winning, not certainty. Combat never offers certainty, but reasonable odds 50-50 perhaps, maybe better if the crew was skilled and got the first shot. This meant tactics could change. Aggressive advances became possible. Commanders could commit armor without automatically calculating the butcher's bill. The psychological relief this provided cannot be overstated. In the final weeks of the war, as American forces pushed deeper into Germany, Pershing crews developed reputations within their divisions. Other tankers knew which units had Pershings. When serious German resistance was expected, when Panthers or Tigers might be present, commanders requested Pershing support. The tanks became, in a sense, the fire brigade The heavy hitters called in when Sherman units faced opposition they couldn't handle. This created an interesting dynamic. Pershing crews saw more dangerous combat than average tank crews. Their casualty rates, paradoxically, were sometimes higher than Sherman crews despite having better protection, because they were always sent to the difficult assignments, always put in situations where German armor was expected. The law of averages caught up. Better protection helps, but enough combat, enough exposure, and eventually luck runs out. One Pershing commander, Lieutenant John Grimble of the 3rd Armored Division, kept a diary during the final advance into Germany. His entries reveal the strain. March 15th, 1945. Engaged 2 Panthers today. Destroyed both. Lost our bow gunner. Shell penetrated the machine gun port. Same vulnerability as the Shermans. We're better, but we're not invincible. March 23rd. Command keeps sending us forward. Every time there's serious resistance, it's us. The boys are exhausted. The tank is holding up, but the crew is breaking down. April 2nd. Crossed the Rhine yesterday. Today we're supposed to push toward Paderborn. Intelligence says there are Tigers in the area. Always Tigers. Always us going to find them. Grimble survived the war, but his gunner didn't, killed on April 9, 1945, less than a month before Germany surrendered. A Panzerfaust, a German one-man anti-tank weapon, struck the turret side. The shaped charge punched through. The gunner, 21 years old, died instantly. The Pershing, for all its thick frontal armor, couldn't protect against everything, especially not against weapons specifically designed to defeat armor through explosive force rather than kinetic penetration. So this vulnerability to infantry anti-tank weapons was something the Germans had already learned with their own heavy tanks. Tigers and Panthers, nearly impervious to tank fire from many angles, were still vulnerable to determined infantry with shaped charges. The Panzerfaust, based on captured American bazooka designs, could penetrate over 200 millimeters of armor, enough to threaten any tank, regardless of how thick its armor plating. The post-war analysis of the Pershing revealed interesting insights into the differences between American and German tank design philosophy. When engineers examined captured German tanks alongside American designs, clear patterns emerged. German tanks were optimized for specific performance parameters. The Panther was designed to kill at range, to dominate in open terrain where its gun and frontal armor provided maximum advantage. The Tiger was designed to be a breakthrough weapon, nearly impervious frontally, capable of destroying any enemy tank it encountered. But this specialization came with costs. German tanks were expensive, complex, required skilled crews and extensive maintenance. The Panther's final drive, the gearing system connecting the transmission to the tracks, was notoriously unreliable. Average lifespan before failure was around 900 miles. For a tank that might need to travel hundreds of miles just to reach the front, this was catastrophic. Units would arrive at the battlefield with a third of their Panthers broken down, waiting for replacement parts that Germany's collapsing logistics system couldn't provide. The Tiger had similar problems. Its interleaved road wheel system, designed to distribute weight and improve ride quality, was brilliant in theory. In practice, it was a maintenance nightmare. Mud and debris would pack between the wheels and freeze overnight. In winter conditions, crews would spend hours with blowtorches thawing the wheels before the tank could move. In combat conditions, this delay could be fatal. Soviet tankers learned to wait for winter mornings, knowing Tigers would be immobilized and attack before German crews could get their vehicles operational. The Pershing, by contrast, used simpler systems, standard road wheels, no interleaving. The final drive, while strained by the tank's weight, was based on proven Sherman components. When it failed, and it did fail, replacement parts were readily available. Mechanics familiar with Shermans could work on Pershings without extensive retraining. This wasn't elegant engineering. It wasn't optimized, but it was practical. And in war, practical often beats perfect. American engineers studying German tanks after the war were impressed by the sophistication, the precision manufacturing, the innovative solutions to complex problems. But they also noted the brittleness, the lack of redundancy, the assumption that tanks would always have access to workshops and spare parts. German tanks were designed for a war Germany thought it would fight quick campaigns, decisive battles, short supply lines, and they weren't designed for the war Germany actually got: multi-year attrition, degraded infrastructure, constant Allied bombing, disrupting production and supply chains. The Pershing, arriving late, benefited from these lessons. American designers had watched German tanks succeed and fail for 3 years before finalizing the Pershing's design. They understood what worked. They understood what didn't. The result was a tank that borrowed German innovations, sloped armor, and powerful gun, but implemented them within an American engineering philosophy: reliability over perfection, maintainability over optimization, good enough to win, simple enough to keep winning. This design philosophy would define American armored vehicle development through the Cold War. The M60 tank, serving from the 1960s through the 1990s, was deliberately designed with component redundancy and ease of maintenance as primary considerations. The Moan Abrams, despite its sophisticated gas turbine engine and composite armor, retained this focus on reliability. American tankers in Desert Storm, in Iraq, and Afghanistan could push their Abrams tanks harder and farther than opponents expected because the vehicles simply didn't break down. Maintenance crews could perform major repairs in field conditions with limited tools. This wasn't accidental. It was the legacy of lessons learned in World War II, when German tanks dominated on paper but failed in practice. The intelligence reports German commanders received about the Pershing in those final weeks were fragmentary and often contradictory. Some reports described it as a heavy tank comparable to the Tiger. Others called it a medium tank, essentially an upgraded Sherman. The confusion was understandable. Only a handful of Pershings were in Europe. Encounters were rare, and in the chaos of Germany's collapse, with communications disrupted and command structures fragmenting, accurate information was hard to obtain. But what German commanders did understand, what filtered through even incomplete reports, was that American tank capabilities had improved significantly, that frontal engagements, once heavily favored toward German armor, were now dangerous, but that the tactical advantages they'd relied on for years were eroding. This psychological shift, more than the actual battlefield impact of 20 or 30 Pershings, may have been the Pershing's most significant contribution to the war's end. By German tank commanders who'd operated with near impunity against Sherman suddenly had to consider retreat, had to calculate odds, had to wonder if that tank appearing around the corner was a Sherman they could destroy easily or a Pershing that might kill them. This hesitation, this uncertainty, created opportunities for American forces. Even Sherman crews benefited because German tank commanders couldn't be certain what they were facing until engagement range, and by then, if American tanks had numerical superiority, it was often too late. The famous Tiger ace Michael Whitman, killed in Normandy in August 1944, long before the Pershing arrived, had once expressed contempt for Allied tanks. "They have quantity," he said. "We have quality. Quality will always prevail." But Whitman died when 5 Sherman Fireflies, British tanks mounting powerful 17-pounder guns, caught his Tiger in a coordinated ambush. Quantity, it turned out, combined with even modest quality improvements, could overwhelm German armor. The Pershing represented the next step in that evolution. Not just quantity, not just modest improvements, but genuine capability. The psychological confidence that American tankers, given equal equipment, were just as skilled, just as deadly as their German counterparts. The irony is that by the time this philosophy was fully realized, tank versus tank combat was becoming rare. Modern anti-tank missiles, helicopters, precision-guided munitions. The Moen Abrams, the current American main battle tank, is a technical marvel. Composite armor, gas turbine engine, 120mm smoothbore gun, capable of destroying any tank on Earth. But it's rarely used in tank versus tank combat, because modern warfare doesn't work that way anymore. Still, the Abrams exists, and its existence, its capability, its dominance on paper, if not always in practice, traces back to lessons learned in 1944 and 1945, when American tankers died in Shermans because someone decided good enough was acceptable. When German tank commanders laughed at American armor, because for years they were right to laugh, and when finally, in the closing months of the war, America fielded a tank that made that laughter stop. The Cologne duel wasn't the largest tank battle, wasn't the most tactically significant, but it was symbolic proof that American industry, given time and motivation, could produce weapons equal to anything Germany fielded, that the technological gap, so devastating in 1943 and 1944, could be closed. That German superiority in armored warfare wasn't permanent, wasn't inevitable. Bartelborth, the Panther commander, survived the war, returned home, and told his family about the tank he almost mistook for a German vehicle, the low silhouette, the unfamiliar profile, the 90mm gun that punched through armor his Panther was supposed to be immune to. He'd fought on the Eastern Front, survived years of combat against Soviet tanks, but the Pershing, that one engagement in Cologne, that stuck with him because it represented change, the end of certainty, the knowledge that Germany's advantage was gone. Clarence Smoyer, the Pershing gunner, lived to 99, spent decades wondering about the German crew, wondering if they survived. When he learned Bartelborth had escaped, Smoyer expressed relief. He'd been following orders, doing his job, fighting a war, but he was glad he hadn't killed them all, glad there were survivors, because by then, in old age, the war seemed less about nations and ideologies, and more about young men thrown into situations none of them controlled. The Pershing that fought at Cologne, serial number 30,308, nicknamed Eagle 7 by its crew, survived the war and was later displayed in various museums and events. The very same gun that fired those 3 shots, the same turret, the same hull, a physical reminder of a moment when history turned, when American armor finally matched German tanks, when tankers could fight without feeling like. When the contempt German commanders had felt for so long met reality and shattered. That's the real story, not just about one tank killing another, but about the end of an era, the final months of German tank superiority, the closing of a technological gap that had cost thousands of American lives, the vindication of tankers who'd complained, who demanded better equipment, who'd been told to make do with what they had, and the beginning of a new doctrine, one that said American soldiers deserved the best equipment, not just the most equipment, not just good enough equipment, the best.